Hi, everybody. I'm Allison Freyberg, and welcome to Lecture 15, Organizing Your Ideas. Okay, as usual, let's start with a couple of questions. How do you organize ideas for a writing project? And this is always the place where we have to be a little honest, right? So, is this you? I decide what my thesis is, and then I write an outline. It's probably a lot of you, because it's probably how you were taught. We're going to be working against that idea today. How about this one? I brainstorm ideas and try to see how they fit together. Reasonable. You're trying to do some pre-writing, some generating of ideas. You see how they fit together. How about number 3? I organize research notes to back up my position or point. I think this covers a lot of people. We do a lot of research. It feels productive. We're doing research, right? And then turns out it's a day before the paper's due and you're still immersed in the research. And that's a matter of really planning our time, which we talked about in, I believe, lecture 1. Okay. How about this one? I just start writing and hope it flows. We've probably all been one of these things at one time or another. I do tend to be number 3. I'll tend to research and research and research until I have not given myself enough time to actually create the article or create the manuscript or essay. So I'm with you on these. Oh, one thing I also wanted to say about all of these techniques that I'm introducing in this lecture series, I've tried them all because writing's hard, and it's hard for me, and I'm a professional writer. So I'm always looking for techniques that will help me out of trouble spots because I have a lot of trouble spots. And the whole process of writing is not something I've ever found to be easy. And I'm always looking for ways to make things a little easier for myself. All right. Here are the top causes in my world of organization frustration. And they are both tied to employing bad techniques that really aren't your fault. You were taught to do this stuff, most likely. And the problem with these two techniques is that they create obstacles rather than opportunities. So it's not your fault, really. Here's bad technique number 1, and that's creating outlines early in the process of a writing project. We'll talk about why that happens. Bad technique number 2 is choosing form before content, and that's probably the most important thing I'm going to introduce today. Let's have a little bit of a deeper dive into these bad techniques. Creating outlines early in the writing process. Probably thinking, what? Of course you want to create an outline. Think about what you were taught to do first in the writing process. Think about it. Write it down. Jot it down. You were probably taught to develop a thesis first. The thesis, your assertion, your point, your claim, the whole thing, the message, the whole thing you're trying to get across. You were probably told to come up with it first, and then to make an outline. Think about it for a minute. If a thesis is your answer, and an outline is the supporting evidence for that answer, and those are the first things you've been taught to do in the process of writing an analysis, how effective are you going to be? You have to come up with an answer at the beginning of the whole experience? That's ridiculous. What kind of answer are you going to come up with? Probably something really superficial, obvious, vague, useless, common knowledge. It's not your fault. You shouldn't have to come up with a claim, a decision at the beginning of the experience. And even harder to do is come up with an outline. So you made up an answer, and now you're going to make up points to support that answer, and then you're going to end up with a writing experience that's miserable for you, that's miserable for your audience, that delivers nothing to the conversation. We're going to talk about getting away from that. And we introduced this concept as sort of pathway early on in our lectures. That maybe at the beginning you want to come up with your topic, like just the subject you're writing about, and maybe brainstorming and looking at the research and stuff will give you ideas on that. But then you really want to develop a question that you want your analysis to answer, not the decision, but at this point in the experience, a question. And then you spend the rest of the process really just trying to answer that question. It's a much different position to be in. You're not tied to an answer that you made up at the beginning of all this, or worse, that you simply read in an article and decided, oh, I believe that, so I'm going to say that too. If you can get yourself in a space where you develop a how or a why question that really asks you to explore, that relies on your curiosity, that asks you to figure something out, how much more exciting and productive a process is that going to be? Let a question guide you, right? So don't talk to me. Please do not talk to me about thesis and outline at the beginning of your process. Talk to me about topic and question. You will find that the process is a lot more productive. Quite frankly, because you're invested in it. Now, bad technique number 2 is where we'll form the bulk of our analysis here. This is choosing form before content. Think for a minute about the standard organization format you were taught. Remember that? This one, right? Introduction with your thesis in it. How many points did you need to support that thesis? 3, right? I don't know where that came from because we like 3s. It's completely arbitrary. And then a conclusion that reiterates those 3 reasons for your thesis and says, see, I'm right, in fancier words. Hey, it works. What's so bad about it? Well, what happens if your content doesn't fit? What happens if you have 2 amazing ideas that help you answer a question? What are you going to do? Come up with a 3rd idea just because someone told you you needed 3 ideas? It's ridiculous. You don't choose the form before you choose the content. What happens if you have 4 really key ideas that are interwoven with each other, and that by the time you get to the end of it, you have a brilliant analysis? You're going to cut one idea because people told you can only have 3 ideas? Ridiculous. Here's an example, a metaphor, an analogy. I like shoes. It's no secret. I like shoes. So when I go to the DSW, if I started with form before content, I'd look at any of the shoe sizes, right? Because that's the shoe. That's what I shove my foot into. But if I find the most amazingly beautiful, cute pair of size 5 shoes, who cares? Because I have size 8.5 feet. It won't fit. It doesn't fit. You got to look at your foot before you look at the shoe. You got to look at your content before you look at the container you're going to put it in. Now, I do have an example of this with a picture of margaritas, but since this is a public lecture, I'll save that for class time. Let's try to get away from bad technique too. Let's do a couple of illustrations about bad technique number 2. So this is a yummy cup of coffee because almost all cups of coffee are yummy. Your job as an analyst is to make sure a reader doesn't go get a cup of coffee while they're reading your project. Because as soon as someone leaves your project, for whatever reason, coffee's the example here, they're never coming back. They're moving on to the next project. So you have got to make sure that when people start your reading your writing project, that they finish. Here's an illustration. This is when you choose form first. This is the 5-paragraph essay that everyone was taught and that we rely on even though we don't even realize we're relying on it. This is the one that has an introduction first, supporting reason 1, supporting reason 2, supporting reason 3. The thesis is in the introduction, and then your conclusion repeats the thesis and summarizes the supporting reasons. As you can tell from my tone, I'm not happy with this format, but let's see why. So supporting reason 1 serves to, obviously, support your thesis. Supporting reason 2 helps your thesis. Supporting reason 3 helps your thesis. And then you just repeat them all down here, right? There's a problem because if someone's reading your work and they're trying to get away, this is just a visualization of the process. If they try to get out here, they can't, right? Because the arrows are blocking. They're creating a connection between the supporting reason and the thesis that's mentioned in the introduction. But I'm reading, I can't get out this way, but you know what? I can get out this way, I can get out this way, and this way. And what happens? The coffee wins. Because I'm reading and there's no connection made between the reasons. If you look back at these types of essays we've all written, chances are your paragraphs start with sentences such as, and another reason, or second, because we're trying to make up transitions that don't exist. Because any of these could have appeared in any order, and you probably learned some completely arbitrary reasoning on how to order these. Oh, put the best idea first, put the worst idea second, put the sort of middle idea third, and that way you're kind of burying the worst idea and starting with the strength, or maybe you start with the weakest and build it. This is all completely arbitrary and has nothing to do with the content. You might as well just juggle them and see where they land and put them in your paper that way. And FYI, every time you start a paragraph with another reason or another blah, 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 you may as well write, go get coffee and forget my work, because that's the signal you're sending. You're saying, hey, there's no real connection between these two ideas, so this is a good chance for you to stop. And if you send that message, people are going to hear it. Now, here's an illustration of what happens when you choose content first, when what you have to say determines how you say it, and you don't adopt some prefabricated mold. In this case, each idea not only helps to answer the guiding question, not the thesis, but the guiding question, and each idea leads to the next idea. We still have our cup of coffee, all right? And here's our paper. Now this kind of looks like, oh, there's just 5 points, but wait a minute. So this is like the 7-paragraph essay, right, Allison? No. Now, first of all, the change here is you've noticed you've only included your guiding question. Maybe you didn't include your thesis or your findings in the introduction. Maybe you did. Maybe you didn't. But you do need to commit to a guiding question. And we'll talk a lot more about this in the Introductions, Conclusions, and Abstracts lecture coming up. And yeah, you know, content idea A, content idea B, C, D, and E, and that's completely arbitrary here. It could have been F, G, H, whatever. They all help to elucidate the guiding question. They help to answer it. They speak to it in some way. Conclusion as well, because notice here the conclusion kind of deals with implications. It doesn't just repeat. Okay, so that's great. So I'm reading. I cannot get out this way. But what's going to keep me from getting out this way to get the coffee? In this case, your guiding question sets up the first idea. And then you talk about content idea A. But you choose this order because you couldn't talk about B without having introduced the idea of A. You couldn't talk about C without B first. You couldn't talk about D without C first, and you couldn't talk about E without D first. And you couldn't talk about implications unless you'd gone through that process. Now we're going to look at kind of a live example of that, but just look at the formatting. When you have your ideas speak to each other and lead out of each other, you limit my ability as a reader to get out. And then if I can get to your conclusion without getting a cup of coffee, you have been persuasive. And why not get your form to help your content rather than just be some container you shove your content in arbitrarily? Now, here's an illustration of content first in action. And what I'm choosing here is the critical approach. Remember, lecture 2 was critical approaches. And we talked about an application. We talked about unexpected similarity, unexpected difference, assumption, dismissal, and omission as our possible critical approaches for an analysis. Well, I'm taking the first one. This is the application, okay, of a concept or a theory to a specific situation, case, industry, organization, context. Okay? We're taking a concept and applying it to something. Now, so the first part, the first movement, the first section of your analysis would be an introduction that introduces the guiding question, which is, in this case, how does concept A apply to organization X? Again, apologies for all the algebra, but I wanted to make it applicable in multiple situations. So that's what's going to guide our analysis, right? Okay, so what would come next? Reasonably, it sounds like I better explain what this concept is. Right? I have the introduction, which says, hey, here's a concept, here's an organization, we're going to figure out what happens here. So the first thing to do, or the next thing to do, this would be content A. What's the concept being implied? Really spend some time explaining it. By the way, a sentence is not enough explanation, okay, for a real concept. Then the next thing you might want to do, now that the concept's explained, you might want to explain what that context is that you're going to apply it to. If it's going to be a certain organization, well, you should explain that organization and the situation. All right, so concept, and then the organization. And then your next section, which is probably your biggest section. These are not paragraphs. It's just simply the direction that your paper moves. The longest section would be trying to figure out how that concept, now that you've explained it, applies to that situation, now that you've explained it. If you start doing this stuff first, all you're going to do is confuse people because they don't know what concept you're talking about. They don't know what organization you're talking about. This might be a page, this might be a page. I don't know. This might end up being 5, 6, 7, 8 pages. I don't know. But you don't want to get to this stuff before you've done this stuff. Why does this matter? You've gone through and figured out how this concept applies in to this organization. You really like what you've done there. The reader's still going, okay, I really like what you've done there, but why does it matter? So this might be a good point to deal with that kind of stuff. Again, there's no page limit on this. These aren't paragraphs, but you probably want to talk about significance in detail after you've actually done the application. And maybe your conclusion deals with what the implications are. Now, you might be saying, Allison, this just looks like a formula, like the 5-paragraph essay formula. Okay, it's a bit of a template, but it's a template based on content movement. It's not a prefabricated form that you shove content into. Okay, I can't get to the situation until I've explained the concept. I can't get to the application part or how we see the concept working in the organization until I've told people a little bit about the organization. And you know what? I'm not going to really have a detailed discussion of the significance of what this concept looks like in this organization until after I've actually shown how it applies. And I'm not going to really deal with the implications until I figure out why it matters. So these movements build out of each other. And I think that is a much more powerful way to organize. And there's your takeaway. One thing you'll notice is, even from the early lectures, I tend not to deal with organization until later in the experience of the process, right? I want your drafts to be a mess. You're getting the sand in the sandbox. Then we organize. And that's why I don't like recommending that you start with a thesis and an outline, because those are decisions you make much later on in the experience of writing a paper, an analysis. I'm very interested in you thinking about topics and questions early on in the experience, but not decisions and outlines. Make a mess, then organize. And we'll finish off this lecture. I'm going to introduce you to 5 organization strategies that you can try depending on kind of what speaks to you, how you like to work. So one, it's a post-draft summary chart, a post-it jigsaw puzzle, something I call draft paper scissors, some signposting, and a paragraph inventory. You can see I like inventories a lot. Okay, the post-draft summary chart is very similar. It's the same thing as I had you do early on with how to summarize everything. Right? You make a summary chart and it helps you do that, except this time you're doing it to your own writing. You're the author. So once you have a draft, and that's what's important here, you have to have a draft. I don't think you should do outlines until you're outlining a draft that you've already written. In other words, you're doing an inventory. So for this case, you take your paper and you number the paragraphs. And this is, obviously just your number. However many paragraphs you have, you'll have a row for. Then what you do is make a chart like this, and you write down every point in each of those paragraphs that you make. You don't assess them yet. You just write them down. You're drawing a map of your paper. So if you have 3 points in paragraph 2, you just write them down. If you have three main ideas in paragraph 2, don't worry about it yet. Just write them down. Get an accurate map of your paper. Okay, if you cannot discern an idea in paragraph 3, you just write down no idea. Okay? And you do this until you've filled in your paper, which means that you should be able to read through this middle column and understand your argument, right? So these should be filled in boxes. Don't just do little word signals. This is really writing your summary chart. And then you look at the next step, you look at your completed map. So which paragraphs have too many ideas and need to be separated out? By the way, how many ideas should be in a paragraph? One. One idea with sufficient warrants and evidence to make it a viable idea or a substantiated idea. Ask yourself which paragraphs lack key explanation or information. Ask yourself which paragraphs need to be moved to connect with other ideas. Oh, wow, look, paragraph 3 and paragraph 7 really lead into each other well. I should put them closer together. Maybe you realize that paragraph 8 doesn't have a point, or maybe it has an amazing point, but not one that's related to this paper. It doesn't belong here. And maybe you notice that idea 4 and idea 5 work, but you kind of need a paragraph 4A between the two to connect them more. There needs to be more explanation between those two ideas. So you might want to add stuff. And you just write down your actions here. You can do this on a piece of paper, you can do this on the computer. I tend to just do it on the computer and move stuff around and take stuff out and separate stuff. By the way, if your paragraph has 3 ideas, each idea deserves its own paragraph. So there should be 2, 2A, and 2B. Okay. And the reason I recommend this, in fact, the next 2 techniques as well, is because it is really hard to take a 10-page draft and try to think about reorganizing it. Number one, it's hard. You've just put everything into getting these 10 pages out. The only thing you want to be done, the only thing you want to happen is to be done and press send. But if you draw a map like this, a summary chart of your draft, you're much more likely to see things. Oh, wow, paragraph 3 and paragraph 7, they really speak to each other. They need to be closer together. Wow, what's paragraph 6 doing there? I have no idea. So even if that paragraph 6 helped you to get to page 10, it doesn't belong there. And you can see it when you have a map. It's much easier to actually revise. Revise, to see, re-vision, to see your work again. This is a way to see your work again. Now, let's say you don't like charts. You're not a chart person. Another way to do this is with Post-its. Again, after you've written your draft, then you take a pack of Post-its out, and every idea that you find in your paper, you put on a Post-it. And there are lots of ideas in your paper. It's not like there's 3 ideas, right? Everything that you're trying to prove, every idea, every assertion gets its own Post-it. Then what you do is you put the paper aside, you don't even look at it, and you take your Post-its and you shuffle them up and you spread them out. And then you put them on a wall or a desk in an order that makes sense. Don't try to remember the order it was in. Look at your content, look at your ideas, your assertions, and put them in an order that makes sense. Like what we were talking about earlier, right? A content-driven order. It's just a visual version of the summary chart, or a different kind of visual version. So if you like to kind of move stuff around, tactile, with your hands and stuff, then this is great. The order of your draft is going to change. You're going to notice that there's a post-it there that might be a great idea, but it doesn't belong in the paper. You might notice you need to add ideas. So there needs to be maybe between this post-it and this post-it, another post-it to connect them. And you just build it. You build it on your wall, you build it on a table, you build it on the floor, you build it wherever you want. But you let go of the draft and organize with the post-its. A lot of writers have told me they really enjoy this one. Me, not so much. I'm more of a summary chart person. This gets a little unwieldy for me, but a lot of people really, really like it. I'd say probably 75% of writers I work with enjoy this technique. And if you want to get really hardcore on this, what you can do, and we've done this in class back in the day, we do something called draft paper scissors. And this is when you print out the draft, okay? But then you cut out the ideas. Every idea gets cut out. So all the pages go away, all the headers, what if you have footers, whatever those are, any identifying markers of where this idea appeared in your paper are gone. Now, if you had a paragraph that had 3 ideas, well, then you cut 3 pieces out of that paragraph. And there's something, again, some people really enjoy this technique, and it's just very visceral. Well, same thing, you make puzzle pieces, right? And kind of like Post-its, you reorder them in something that makes content-driven sense. One idea must lead to the next. And again, you'll notice you need blank pieces of paper to add a paragraph of connection. You might have a puzzle piece that just doesn't belong, that needs to go in a different puzzle somewhere along the way. And you might find that you need to build paragraphs because your idea is tiny because you shoved 4 ideas in one paragraph originally. You move stuff around, all the same kind of stuff. So those are 3 techniques: summary chart, post-its, draft paper scissors, that all have the same objective, which is to get you to see your ideas that exist in your draft and to reorganize them or organize them in a way that makes content-driven sense. Another technique, and this is more when you're kind of ready, you think your paper's ready to submit. It's called signposting. And what you do is you take your draft, what you think is your final draft, what you think is your final draft, and you get a partner and you have to read the paper paragraph by paragraph to your listening partner. And what you do is you read the paragraph and then you ask the listening partner, what do you think comes next? What would make sense coming next? And then you read the next paragraph. And if it doesn't match what your reader senses would be best coming next, you've got a problem that you can focus in on. And chances are your reader's right. Because if there's not enough signaling to know what would make sense next, then you're not sending the right messages as a writer. A paper is always a relationship between a writer and a reader. And if you can really see it this way, you're going to have an easier time communicating your messages. It's not a homework assignment. It's a relationship between people. And this little exercise makes that real. Now, the last organization technique I'm going to bring in is what I call paragraph inventory, and that's more a micro-organizational practice. The other techniques were all about the big picture, right? Organizing the essay. This is about taking a little closer look and looking at your paragraphs to make sure that they have an internal organization as well. Because it's not good enough to just make sure there's one idea in a paragraph and everything has to do with that one idea. The sentences have to reach out to the next sentence. So it's basically a summary chart for your paragraphs. You want to number your sentences in your paragraph. You want to identify what each sentence is doing. And then you want to see, do I need to move stuff around? Maybe sentence 4 has nothing to do with this idea and I have to cut it out. Maybe there's something about the idea I haven't explained and I need to add something. I have a tendency, for example, in my writings, because I've used this paragraph inventory a lot, I have a tendency to, in my drafting, put the idea in my second sentence that really should be much later on in the paragraph. It's almost like I'm unconsciously afraid I'm going to lose the idea, so I shove it right at the in sentence 2, and then I don't have to worry about it, and then I go through and explain how sentence 1 and 2 connects. And that's not a terrible way, but I have noticed it can kind of be jarring to readers, and I'll move stuff around a little bit. But you can't do that unless you actually draw the map of your paper, of your paragraph. All right, so here's our recap. Don't outline too early in the process. Don't force form to determine your content. Do embrace a messy process. Do yourselves a favor and don't organize until you're about halfway through the actual experience, until you have a draft. Make a mess, then clean it up. Do let content determine your form. Let what you have to say determine how you're going to say it. Pre-packaged little forms, like 5-paragraph forms, don't help. We covered 5 strategies for organizing: the post-draft summary chart, the Post-it jigsaw puzzle, draft paper scissors. Those are all 3 of the same objective, except they're different ways of doing them. The signposting exercise to help you become aware of the relationship between you as a writer and your audience as a reader. And to do a little micro work, here's that paragraph inventory. And that is everything I know right now about organization. I'll see you in the next lecture.